look, I'm not an environmental expert, but I do have strong feelings about how effective BRI has been and how it's evolved. So, I think at the very beginning, the idea of building strong, ongoing, constructive relationships with developing countries made all kinds of sense. A, because there's an enormous need, because especially in the various forms of infrastructure, they're not prepared. But the second reason that it's very compelling is China has been a world leader in infrastructure and probably has an excess of capability and capacity. So to the extent you could leverage a skill that already exists in countries that need it, make all kinds of sense. Now, in the early days, there was a lot of criticism from the West. A lot of that criticism wasn't based on anything real. It was based on the fact that the West has relatively weak relationships with developing countries because they've added relatively little value to them. So they basically say, we're America, we're a democracy, you should want to team with us. But it was that high level assertion as opposed to delivering something real. But the criticisms early on, I think some of them were legitimate. So they basically, because some of the countries did not have the financial wherewithal to ultimately repay the loans or meet the obligations that were agreed to. So China did come back and say, going forward, in what I will call the second round of moving forward, was we're going to do due diligence and make sure that the financial obligations that we negotiate with the countries are things that they can meet, as opposed to creating debt. And because that's ultimately going to create tension. So if you wind up having to take over a port or something else that the country didn't really want to give up, you're going to leave some bad feelings. And then the other challenge was on the environmental side, that a lot of the infrastructure development required burning a lot of coal, and that obviously was bad for the environment. So my only advice is not specific to exactly what you do from a technical point of view, but I think building close working relationships with and treating each country, developing country, as a client, should you get you to the point where you understand what the country is trying to do in terms of environmental sustainability. And then once you know what they're trying to do, then you should work with them in a way that delivers that. So that's different from you going in with your own point of view about what they should be doing with the environment. I spent many years at McKinsey, and one of the first things you learn is you have to understand what the client is trying to get done and how they're trying to do it. And when you really understand that, then you could be very helpful by providing real incremental value, but you can't impose your ideas on what they ought to be doing. So my advice to China is the direction is sound. The corrections that you've already made in terms of financial due diligence on the one hand and understanding environmental impact on the other is smart. So to me, the next wave is really investing more in understanding what each of those countries want and making sure that what you're lining up to give them is what they want and need. And if you do that, you're going to be in a great position. Well, first of all, the real underlying issue is what's the nature of the relationship on both sides. The negative posture of a relationship is containment. My own feeling is that China will never be contained. So it's a very foolish goal for anyone to think that with sanctions or whatever you're going to do, you're going to slow China down. In fact, I think the opposite is true. So I think that if you look at what the U.S. has been doing vis-a-vis chip technologies, which is much more broadly based than is something that represents a real security threat. So I think if you could get into the hearts and minds of the Americans who are coming up with the sanctions, the real underlying motive is how do we hurt China economically and limit their growth? That's not a noble aspiration. It's totally legitimate to say, we're not going to make available our most sophisticated nanochips that could have very clear military implications because you are a rival. But that's very different from the mindset of, we don't want you to be successful economically. So, and now if you look at the net effect of the US's position of containment, what's China done? China's done totally predictably, invested more in becoming independent. So the challenge is going to be when China becomes truly independent, let's say 5 years out on most of the chips, the last thing they're going to want to do is cooperate with the U.S. because they're going to remember them as the ones who tried to hold them back. You know, so my feeling is America should be much more laser focused in sanctions and make sure that there are legitimate competitive reasons for not making available certain categories of chips. And if you instead look for areas where the U.S. could be helpful. So if we have chip manufacturers and they're producing what I would call middle stage chips as opposed to very high end with military implications, and they're the best provider of those chips in terms of cost and quality, the U.S. should be encouraging U.S. companies to provide those to the Chinese. And to the extent the U.S. starts to take a more positive posture on things like that, then they'll build a constructive relationship. And there'll always be competition, but competition is very different from trying to hold China down. And so I think China would respect the U.S. for being competitive. It will never respect it for containment. And the problem is, if you do containment on a sustained basis, when China is truly independent, the last thing they're going to do is to be inclined to do anything to support the U.S. because all you did was try to hurt them. That's just human nature. So to me, it's very much a mindset issue. It's not about the details. It's not about the technicalities. But I remember reading a quote from one of the Americans who were involved in the trade side, and they were talking about certain chips that we were not going to make available, and the comment was, the good thing is this will hurt their economy. That's a mindset that says it all, and it's really counterproductive. Well, let me break the U.S. down into three different categories. One category is the government. A second category is business. And the third category is citizens at large, individuals. And I think you have to think about those very differently. If you look at government's understanding of China would not pass a sixth grade test in terms of the basics of China. So if you ask congressmen basic questions about Confucian values, about culture, the answers you would get back would be totally naive. Okay, and so, but if you then move to businesses, the people in the U.S. who really understand China deeply are the businesses who've been very active in China over time. So when I talk to them, they totally understand the role of the government is very powerful, and they decide to get involved wherever they want to. And by the way, the government has delivered for the people and the country for certainly over reform and opening up, which goes back over 40 years. So they have the support of the people. But unfortunately, the U.S. has so stigmatized China that the U.S. corporations are nervous about saying things that are constructive about China because they will be viewed as pro-China, and then the U.S. will look to make life difficult for them. That's a very negative outcome, because the reality is the people who in the U.S. who really understand China well could be very effective spokesmen for China, not saying we like China's model because it's very different from ours, but you would at least get a very informed opinion from them because they really understand China. You know, I talked to someone at Peking University who said, we hosted 19 congressmen who came over. And so I asked the question, and I said, how many of you have been to China more than once? One hand went up. How many of you been here once? Two hands went up. That leaves roughly 15, 16 people who had never been to China. China is a very big, complicated country. So the problem we have is the total lack of understanding. And the book that I wrote, Powerful, Different, Equal, was really focused entirely on how do we help each side understand that their models are grounded in the history and culture of each country, and those histories and cultures are totally different, which explains why their models are totally different. And yet to this day, when you ask a lot of Americans about China, they say, oh, it's a communist country, like, you know, like just like Russia. Come on, China has nothing to do with Russia. And the reality is China, when you look at the people, when people use words like family-oriented, ambitious, good sense of humor, kind, hardworking, you're describing Chinese people and you're describing American people. So at the people-to-people level, when I talk to people in America who have spent time with Chinese people, they always come back and say, I love the people, but I don't like the government. And I said, well, you have to think hard about that, because the reality is the Chinese people like their government, and they think they've really delivered. So there's a disconnect in how you're thinking about it. So let me go to the third group, which are everyday citizens. I think if you get to people who are like 35 and older, I think they've been living long enough in the media-dominated anti-China mode that changing their minds is going to be extremely difficult. I mean, it's the reason why almost nobody bought my book in the U.S., because they're not interested at the end of the day. But if I think about my younger daughters who are in their 20s, they are totally positive vis-a-vis China, because they've each been to China, they have a lot of friends who are Chinese, and they view the very senior level anti-China feeling as totally politically driven, which is what it is. And if you could get inside the heads of the U.S. politicians in terms of what they really, what do they know about China? Next to nothing, but they realize that if they are anti-China publicly, they will get more votes. And that's all that motivates them. There's no interest in really understanding how China works, what its priorities are, what the feelings of the people genuinely are. So we say things like, well, the Chinese aren't allowed to protest their government. And yes, talk to Chinese people and they say, we only have one government. It's done pretty well over time. Why do we want to protest against them, right? But unless you understand things like that, you don't know how to interpret what's going on with China. And the biggest underlying problem is whenever the U.S. criticizes China, China is always, human nature, inclined to respond. The West is declining, or whatever the comment is. Every newspaper picks up anything negative said by China about the U.S., and it's all over the papers. So the unfortunate thing is, the more China speaks up, which I understand why, the more it fans the flames of anti-China feeling. So governments, it's going to take a long time before the governments in the U.S. The Chinese government understands the U.S. extremely well. What it doesn't understand very well is why the Americans are so anti-China. But there are histories that explain that. You know, one of them is the U.S. has been the #1 economy in the world for 150 years. When they start to understand that maybe in the not too distant future, China will pass them, people don't like that. Americans are very competitive. But frankly, it's not that different from the Qing dynasty. So when the West came over and visited China and said, here are all of the wonderful inventions and everything else we have, what was the response? take it away, we don't trust foreigners, we don't need it, we're the leading civilization in the world. Well, that's exactly what the U.S. is saying. So this is human nature. The other thing that is not understood is a lot of Americans just see the word communist and say, oh, China, that's the same as Russia. Well, Russia is a failed country, right? So we saw the disintegration under Gorbachev back in 1989, 1990. And if you look at Russia today, it's a totally failed economy. And all it's got basically is military might and a desire to just reestablish the old Russia. And then the last thing is when Trump came in and made such a mess of COVID, where we had 1 million people die unnecessarily because he did very little about it, what did he go to the public with? They stole our jobs, they stole our IP, and they're a military threat. So if you've got him saying that over and over, and he's a very effective communicator, and you've got it picked up in the press, so every night you pick up the paper or you listen to the news, that's what you're going to hear. So those are the reasons why the anti-China feeling is as strong as it is. But longer term, it's going to disappear because the U.S. is finally going to recognize that China is not an enemy. If you look at what Russia is doing, that's an enemy, right? Militaristic is their model. They use brute force to take over and impose their will. China's track record in militarily over the last 1,000 years is a couple of minor excursions into Vietnam and Korea, and that's it. And frankly, they were so lost in the rounding, no comparison to the aggression that America has shown in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, etc., etc. Well, the problem a little bit is, as long as the federal government is as negative on China as it is, it's going to be very difficult either for local governments or businesses to do something constructive. Now, on a positive note, until you get both sides talking, nothing can happen. And so at least we have the visits of Blinken and Yeltsin and others, and now we have many dialogues going on peer to peer. And so are they actually negotiating things that are going to improve the relationship? No, but everybody knows that unless you start a dialogue, there's no basis of doing anything. So the optimistic side of me will say, as the two parties come together, whether it's State Department or Treasury or trade partner, whoever it is, they're going to come gradually to understand the other side is smart, they're reasonable, they want to make progress, and they want to move towards win-wins. Is it going to happen this year? Probably not. Is it going to happen next year? Maybe some. But it's going to take a while. But I'm optimistic that once both sides realize that they're under economic pressure, and they are, that finding opportunities to work with the other side and create win-wins is a good thing for everybody. But you have to have a mindset where you're open to that. And that doesn't exist today, but the fact that the dialogues are happening, to me, gives me reason to be hopeful that ultimately saner, thoughtful heads are going to prevail. Well, trade ultimately is going to follow the mindset issue, right? So as long as the overarching feeling in the U.S. government is that China is out to make life difficult for and undermine the U.S. for whatever the reason, then it doesn't matter whether it's trade or whether it's immigration or whatever the subject is, under that kind of a cloud, it's not going to be constructive. But so let's say we can turn the corner and at least get to the point where the U.S. understands there are some areas where we can really create win-wins. But that's a big if, and it's a big question mark as to when it happens. But when it does happen, if there are opportunities where where China could say to the U.S., okay, what do you want? And the U.S. is going to come back and say, we'd like you to open your markets more to our financial institutions. And then the U.S. ought to be saying to China, what do you want? We'd like you to be much more focused in your sanctions and not deny us access to chips that have no real military implication. Well, once you get to the point where each side is willing to be honest about what it is they want, then you can start a dialogue that says, okay, we'll give you this and you'll give us that. Then we're in the realm of win-win. It's not going to happen on anything that involves security, so you have to start with the stuff that's not controversial. So everybody recognizes that the environment is an area where everybody has to team together, and everyone would benefit if we had clean water, clean air. And there's no military implication to dealing with the environment. And the same thing's true on health, right? So wouldn't it be nice if the U.S. and China sat down and said, let's share our best thinking on vaccines, let's share our experience with the various strains of COVID, and let's think about how we can help protect each other whenever the next pandemic hits. That's got nothing to do with military, right? So I think if you take what I call the safe areas, the low-hanging fruit, and start to make real progress, then both sides are going to say, well, you know, if we start out with the idea that there are really win-wins, then you have an opportunity to make real progress. And there's certain areas it's never going to get to. So the U.S. is never going to say, we're going to make available to you our most sophisticated chips, which obviously have military implications, but we're going to trust you, it's not going to happen. And China's going to be exactly the same, but that's okay. That's a relatively small part of the areas where cooperation could happen. And obviously we need to get much more flow of people back and forth. I mean, China has been far and ahead advanced to the U.S. because you've got 300,000 or 400,000 students going to school from China in the U.S. And they come away saying, you know, the U.S. is not a bad country. The people are very nice, are very similar to us. And so they don't buy kind of the evil empire rhetoric. The problem is there are very few American students in China today. There used to be relatively few. Now there are even fewer. So you've got to find some way where both countries are promoting more face-to-face involvement. And it's simple things, because having made so many trips to China, I used to be able to fly directly from New York to Beijing. It was 14 hours, it was very comfortable. Now, I fly to Detroit and then Beijing, or this trip I had to fly to London, sit around for 3 hours, and it just makes it a hassle. Why do you want to make it a hassle when it's in everyone's interest that the more face-to-face contact, the more understanding you're going to get? We need people who think about that instead of allowing lower-level bureaucrats to basically impose rules that get in the way.